Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second Breakfast Club. So this is the Liberal Arts Interdisciplinary Research Seminar series that takes place at the early hour of 9 a.m. on a Friday morning. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, who is Amy King. Amy is currently a lecturer in the departments of liberal arts, that's us, and Italian, and she specializes in the history and memory of the far right, with expertise in memory studies and oral history. Her research examines the role memory of secular martyrs has played in the construction of Italian national identity, arguing that martyr stories tell us something about how the nation and its citizens understand their history and identity. She uses methodologies including oral history, direct observation of commemoration ceremonies, and analysis of political attacks on monuments. This latter element makes her research extremely timely given the current global discussion around public memorials. And finally, I'll say that Amy is working on her first monograph, which she is calling at this point, Politics of Sacrifice, Remembering Italy's 1973 Rogo di Primavera, which I've pronounced wrong, which considers the ways in which the memory of the 1973 arson attack has been incorporated into neo-fascist identity, from the Movimento Sociale Italiano to Casa Pound. By demonstrating the relevance of this memory to contemporary neo-fascist identity, it addresses the narratives of persecution that have sustained neo-fascist identity in the face of perceived failure to remember. Okay, so I'm going to ask that if you haven't turned off your microphone, you please turn off your microphone. And I think I will then hand over to Amy. And at the end of Amy's talk, we'll have some time for questions, comments, thoughts. And we're also planning to publish this to our YouTube channel, which we'd love to have some more subscribers on. And that way anybody can revisit it in the future. I hand over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you virtually. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about fascist souvenirs, far-right pilgrimages, and the commercialization of dictatorship in Predappio, which is Mussolini's hometown. When I was writing this is I attended the event and the museum that I'm going to talk about in 2017, so a while back now, and I was in the middle of the last bit of the PhD, writing it all up frantically. So this is the first time I've actually had a chance to go through this this fieldwork that I did. So it's been great to have a chance to do that and to sort of start drawing out some conclusions. But I hope that it might be useful for our liberal artists in terms of thinking about interdisciplinarity, particularly of memory studies, and the process of kind of doing fieldwork and drawing out conclusions. So let's start. I'll start in Predappio, which is the hometown of Mussolini. And it's a town in northern Italy. Probably the biggest major city is Bologna. And then you have to go to get here, I had to go to Forlì, which is outside of Bologna, and then via train, and then take a really long bus route. So quite hard to reach. You have to kind of want to go there if you're a visitor. And Predappio is a really interesting place in terms of fascist memory and architecture, in fact, because Mussolini rebuilt this area in 1925. He kind of built the whole town. He was born and had lived as a child in a nearby village called Dovia, and he'd lived there as a young man, but it wasn't anything really to kind of write home about. So he decided to transform this area, which was previously like a crossroads of mule tracks, into a new town that he wanted to kind of use to show his rationalist fascist architecture and display his kind of plans for cities. I've just done a Google Maps walkthrough here so you can get a sense of what it's like. Sorry, it's a bit jolty. But you can see here the Casa del Fascio, the former fascist headquarters in Predappio, with this classic rationalist architecture in a main piazza with a church on it. So a kind of classic fascist trick of having churches and and fascist headquarters nearby, and the creation of this kind of secular religion. Wide piazzas, which are fantastic for big gatherings, and these very straight roads that people can kind of march down in unison. So this is Predappio now. According to Sofia Serenelli, who's quoted on the slide here, Mussolini transformed his place of birth, the village of Predappio, into a site for the celebration of his own political cult. Predappio was built to accommodate a traditional Catholic religious ritual, pilgrimage. And we can really see that ritual of pilgrimage continuing today, actually. And this is where I move into the stuff that I observed when I visited in 2017 for the anniversary of the March on Rome, which I'll talk about shortly, but just to give you a sense of what it looks like now. And I'm sure if any of you know anything about Predappio, you've probably heard of these shops that sell kind of Mussolini merch, which the video is about to move on to. But just to make it clear, Predappio was really a town that was invented and built from scratch in order to kind of serve fascist propaganda and ritualistic needs and intentions, and facilitate these huge pilgrimages. So here are the souvenir shops. And this was kind of something that he did in many cities. Mussolini restructured many areas of large and small cities in order to kind of reflect fascist architecture and cityscapes. So architecture and public space was very tied up with the ideological project. There's this enormous work done by Mario Isnenghi, which is, I don't know if anyone is familiar with Pierre Norat's work on sites of memory, looking at kind of national identity and physical sites, or flags or monuments and things. But Isnenghi's done a similar thing for Italy. And he argues that alongside Rome, with a different role and evocative force, Predappio became a supporting pillar in the construction of this ideological tourism, through which history acquired visibility and fascist branding, and was then poured into a social body whose national identity and political ideas needed to be reshaped. Another thing to note on Predappio is that there were no hotels built in the town under Mussolini's rule, because he really wanted people to just come and view the architecture and the sites of memory related to his upbringing and his birth very quickly, and it to be very accessible to people who didn't have the money to kind of stay for a weekend and really delve into the town. He wanted it to be a quick and cheap visit so that the most people as possible could actually come and see it and be sort of influenced by this architectural and cityscape propaganda. So pilgrimages under fascism, this video might end up being noisy, so let's see if I can mute it. Good, it is muted. So hopefully this will run in the background, but this is just so you can see the sort of, what's the word that I want in English? Marches and processions of vehicles and people on foot that occurred in Predappio. And people really came and visited, you know, to pay their respects to both Mussolini himself, but also his family, his mother. So the bottom right image is the Santa Rosa Church, which was established to honor his mother, as the mother of this new kind of messiah figure that was going to save Italy after the First World War and kind of bring it to greatness. His former family home, which is the bottom left, is also in Predappio. There's not really anything to see. It's empty. You can walk around, have a quick look inside, but there's no objects inside it really or anything. But people would visit that, and then they would go to the square that I showed you when we did that Google walkthrough, and pay their respects. Visit the Casa del Fascio, and then the family cemetery. There was a tomb there, which you can see actually now, the rebuilt tomb in the video footage. It was a very small and unassuming cemetery, and it was kind of remodeled and expanded around the Mussolini family bodies, so that they became the center point of this grand cemetery, and they continue to kind of attract neo-fascist pilgrims today, which is what I'm going to talk about. So we really see this kind of blending of the secular and the religious, and just one really quick example that shows the extent that the fascist regime went to blend these two elements. This is La Madonna del Fascio, which is in the church that I just showed you that was dedicated to Mussolini's mother. And I've tried to zoom in on the two angels at the bottom who are carrying the fasciolatorio, which is the fascist symbol, the what is that in English? Lictors, I think, the kind of sticks that are bundled together, showing strength kind of in collectivity. That is the symbol of the fascist regime, and you can see the angels giving it to Mary here. So we can really see very clearly this blending of religious and ideological iconography in Predappio. So this research that I did, I went and observed these rituals, commemoration ceremonies, and visited a nearby museum that I'll speak about in a minute. But I really want to argue that Predappio, so Serenelli has argued that Predappio is this continued site of neo-fascist pilgrimage, which it absolutely is. But I think what's missing from existing research is analysis of Villa Carpena, which is a nearby museum in Mussolini's former family home, so not the one he grew up in, but the one where he had his own family and lived with them and with his wife and his 5 children. And it's a private museum now, which I'll show you some photos from my visit. And I think that that really is the culmination of this pilgrimage, this kind of domestic shrine to Mussolini and part of the rehabilitation of his memory in kind of domestic spaces. And as I hope we'll see, he's really upheld as a kind of spectral leader and one to emulate and follow, whose influence continues throughout this museum. So as I said, I attended on the anniversary of the March on Rome in 2017, and this was the 95th anniversary of the March on Rome. The March on Rome is the event through which Mussolini and the black shirts are mythologized as having seized power in Rome through this kind of actual physical march into space and taking over of key public spaces and infrastructure. And it's completely mythologized, and historical accounts show that it was far less punchy than actually it's mythologized as being. Far fewer people took part. Mussolini wasn't even actually there, but regardless of the actual facts, more importantly for my work, it's really upheld as this moment, this great seizure of power on behalf of Mussolini himself as this powerful leader. So I went on the commemoration, the 95th commemoration, and people gather at the tomb. This is Mussolini's family tomb in the image, for his birthday, the anniversary of his death, the March on Rome, other kind of anniversaries linked to him as a person or him as a leader. And this is my kind of sociological aspect of my research, so direct observation at his tomb, very much built on the arguments of Paul Connaughton, who argues that if there's such a thing as social memory, which is kind of memory of an event that you didn't actually live through yourself, but the sharing of memory to create a kind of social group, then we are likely to find it at commemorative ceremonies. So Connaughton's work addresses this transmission of memory at commemorative events, where individuals, as you can see, these people are too young to have actually directly lived through the March on Rome. So they don't have direct biographical experience of this, but they're here to kind of learn about their group history, neo-fascist history, and kind of learn from through ritual and rites and become part of this neo-fascist tradition. And Connaughton argues that social groups are made up of a system or systems of communication which operate at these ceremonies and through kind of rites and rituals. And that's why people resist taking part in commemorative ceremonies, because they're incompatible with their own beliefs, because he argues that to enact a rite is always in some sense to assent to its meaning. And I can attest to that, having gone to this event and felt extremely uncomfortable being surrounded by people doing the fascist salute, and obviously I was not partaking in that, but this kind of building of group identity through kind of embodied rituals and rites was really very clear to me at this event. The shrine itself was built in the late 1920s, I think 1929, as I said, in this reconstruction of the cemetery itself to kind of reconfigure it so that it's centered on the tomb. And his body was stolen after the Second World War, by a neo-fascist who wanted to kind of protect it, stolen for a few months, then found by the authorities, who hid it for, I think it was 11 years, and then it was returned in the late 1950s. So interesting behaviours and kind of tales around the tomb itself and his body. But on the day I visited, there was this kind of constant queue. This is about 100 people. The entrance is up and around the corner, of all ages. You can see kids, and much older people, some of whom had actually, there were some really elderly men who had actually been part of Mussolini's puppet state, the Repubblica di Salò, at the end of the Second World War, who were actually there in uniform. And yeah, harrowingly, this guy holding his daughter's hand was teaching her to do the fascist salute, and kind of really talking about Mussolini as this great father figure, great man. It was really shocking to me to actually hear this. So you enter the crypt and go down some stairs. It's underground, and there are lots of plaques signed by local fascist groups over the decades that commemorate other fascist figures. So it's become this kind of collective tomb for anyone who is associated with Italy's fascist history. And you kind of enter the crypt, go down, and there's a few different rooms for Mussolini himself, and then siblings and other family members. And as people queue up to actually get to the tomb of Mussolini, which is the title image for this presentation with the big head that I showed you, there's a kind of guest book that people sign, and yeah, it's an experience, let's say, but I'll show you some more images in a minute. Right in front of this, at the back of this image, sorry, that's a local church where this famous excommunicated priest, Padre Tam, who is a fascist himself, he often stands on the steps at these events. He wasn't there that year because I think he was unwell, but he stands on the steps of the church right next to the tomb and kind of delivers this sort of hate speech, basically, about current politicians and social changes in Italy and immigration and things like that. And you can see he stands in front of the flag of the fascist regime. He's been excommunicated, so he's not allowed to do this at all, but he still wears his robes as if he were kind of an embodiment of the church. So just to show some images, here are some of the plaques that you see as you go down the stairs into the tomb. And then this is Mussolini's tomb back here. Bottom left, the guy standing in front of the flag doing the fascist salute. That's the fascist, what did I call it before? Guest book, visitor book, where people write kind of messages to him. And I had a quick look, but sort of felt massively uncomfortable here, so skirted through. But it's things like, you know, we will continue to fight for what you fought for, and things like that, and all about kind of this commemorative event as a chance to recommit to Mussolini's memory and the ideological project. And bottom right, yes, this is one of the antechambers that has family members in. And then people tend to leave and gather for photos on the steps of that church. And then they go into church and take part in a mass. So there's this kind of the religious element, having enacted this kind of secular religion, they actually go off to the church and forgive me, Father, for I have sinned kind of things. An amazing kind of set of parallels between the sort of secular rites and the religious rites that then happen next door. And the day usually begins with people gathering for coffee in cafes along that main road that I showed you. And then they start the collective march from the centre up to the tomb, to the cemetery, revisiting a walk that really would have been done by black shirts before them. So there's this kind of idea of history, embodied history kind of repeating itself. And then they visit the tomb and enact the fascist salute and shout presente, which is present, which is the word that all black shirts and Mussolini himself shouted in response to any commemorative events, because the idea was that any fascist who dies is perpetually present through their kind of legacy and spirit that lives on. So we really see the kind of transmission of social memory through these embodied rituals, and indeed through the kind of physical rituals, but also the vocal ones that are carried out there. Just a brief aside, toponyms. So interesting to think about this street that they marched down, because I think the irony would certainly not be lost on them, but it's renamed. This was called Via Mussolini under the regime. With the fall of the regime in the 1940s after the Second World War, there was this explosion in renaming of streets that were associated with the fascist regime. So whether that was fascist martyrs or kind of words associated with the regime, or places and things, or kind of words evoking empire. The new Italian anti-fascist republic quickly renamed all these streets with anti-fascist equivalents. So in most cases that I've looked at, Via Mussolini becomes Via Matteotti. So Matteotti, for those of you who are unfamiliar with him, was the first anti-fascist martyr to be created by the fascist regime. He was the leader of the Italian Socialist Party, and he stood up in Parliament in 1924 and condemned the elections through which fascists had kind of legitimized their seizure of power, which were completely fraudulent. And as he sat down, this was just before the real turn to dictatorship, but it was heading that way. As he sat down from giving this speech, he was reported to have said now to his colleagues, "Now you can begin preparing my funeral oration." And he was kidnapped and killed shortly afterwards. But his memory kind of exploded around the world as a sort of symbol of anti-fascist resistance. And it was, I've done some research on kind of commemoration of him in the US in anti-fascist Little Italy's. And he becomes this kind of real expression of anti-fascist daily resistance. But so by commemorating him, you're showing your kind of resistance to the emerging regime, both in Italy and as it expressed itself in the US. So it was, yeah, fascinating to see these people marching down Viale Matteotti and kind of casting a cursory glance at the street signs and sort of laughing amongst themselves. And there's a quote here from Alderman and Inwood about toponyms, so street names, as expressive and constitutive of the politics of citizenship, conferring a greater degree of belonging to certain groups over others. So the idea that recognition in public space is evidence of a national support for ideals or values represented by that person, which is what we really see with the fall of fascism and the renaming of streets after Italian anti-fascists. Yeah, just an aside, I was fascinated by this kind of symbolic marching down Via Matteotti. Anyway, so after all of these kind of secular and religious rites and rituals, they then march back down to the main bit of Predappio into the souvenir shops. So there's actually a law in Italy that bans fascist slogans and iconography, but only where it's being used to reconstitute the fascist party. So this leaves it kind of massively open to exploitation. And so you have a few of these shops that just sell, like kitsch things that you can see in the central image of mugs and ashtrays and things, lighters, stuff like that, with Mussolini's face on it, but also sort of real objects of reverence, so kind of big statues, big kind of bust of his head. And I listened to a couple having this discussion about whether they thought, each one thought that the massive statue of Mussolini's head that they were considering purchasing was too big for the bedroom, or whether it would be more appropriate for the living room and kind of spatially where it belonged. It's really thought of as a kind of souvenir, almost like taking a relic from a kind of pilgrimage back into the domestic space, being kind of close to the person in question. And I think it's quite easy to sort of laugh off these shops and eye roll them. And it's interesting to see how non-neo-fascists, so people who are just visiting out of interest, really behave there. And there is a kind of sense of incredulity, which is fair enough, but also laughter that I think really misses the point of these shops. This is really part of this kind of ideological tourism that continues. There's a new law, the Legge Fiano, which is about to go through the Italian Senate, I believe, which would make fascist propaganda illegal and punishable. So let's see what happens there and what the repercussions would be for Predappio and these shops. But I am not holding my breath there. So interestingly, in Predappio, this is the site, that big Casa del Fascio that I showed in the early image, which you can see in this top right-hand blue image here. That was going to be turned into Italy's first museum to fascism, which was going to be a kind of hybrid museum and study centre for kind of academic research. Debates around this museum have been going on for years, and they've got an academic committee that have been kind of examining how it might come about and the impact of the layout of artefacts and things. But debates are really rife around whether it would actually exacerbate the problem of pilgrimages to Predappio, and whether it would become this kind of centre, another kind of focal point of it, because people would be able to stand in that building where Mussolini and the black shirts stood and looked out over that big broad piazza, and albeit in a museum situation. And it seems like that idea has now collapsed. I haven't seen any progress, and I think it's now been cancelled, and there's a kind of sympathetic right-wing mayor who has blocked lots of development of this museum. But just to say, there is now no official museum to Italian fascism. So what stands in its place is this unofficial museum that I visited on the day of the anniversary of the March on Rome. So lots of people, having enacted all of those rituals I've just spoken about, then hopped on a bus to the the hills outside of Forlì to visit this museum, which was in Mussolini's former family home, so where he lived with his wife and 5 children. It's called Villa Carpena, and it's behind closed gates. This is the actual building itself, and it's called a Casa dei Ricordi, so a kind of house of memory. So one of these museums that's set up in a former actually real domestic space. And it was set up in, I think, the year 2000 by a local entrepreneur called Domenico Morosini, who bought the house and converted it into this museum. And he had a collection of fascist artifacts, but he also received lots of donations from sympathizers. And it receives around 2,000 to 3,000 visitors annually, they say. Well, that was a few years ago in 2017. I suspect it's risen sharply. It's really hard to get to, so you really have to want to go there. You have to go back to Forlì on the bus, go back to Forlì and then take a taxi to reach it. So it's not, which is probably a good thing, it's not easily reachable. But these kind of closed gates I felt were really symbolic in terms of what I was saying before about the transmission of social memory. This is very much a kind of, you're in this group or you're not in it, you're out of it. This is not kind of being visited by local tourists and people who are anything other than sympathetic to the regime or researchers. And as well as the house, plus there's a kind of small wooden house that Mussolini built for his children. There's huge gardens, commemorative gardens that really form part of the landscape of this shrine, what I think is a shrine, what I'm arguing is a shrine. So we've got the surrounding gardens that have been converted into this kind of miniature cityscape, complete with street names, as you can see in the image on the right. We've got Via Roberto Farinacci, so street names, as I was saying before, in relation to Via Matteotti, this idea of toponyms in public space being used to reflect values of the individuals who name these streets. So we've got Via Graziani, Via Starace, all of these figures who were high up in the fascist regime. And there are lots of monuments as well to fallen fascist figures, such as the monument in the central image to the martyrs, the words on the plaque, not mine, of Piazza Loreto, which was the piazza where Mussolini was hung at the end of the Second World War by partisans. And the plaque that you can't quite read, I don't think, on the right-hand side of that central image reads, they marked our history with their blood, giving it for la patria, so the fatherland. Yeah, in terms of commemorative plaques, there's another one to a woman called Fiorenza Farini, who actually was part of the Women's Auxiliary Service group of the fascist party, and she had been as a teenager, and she was a fascist throughout her whole life. And she actually spent her she was a tour guide at this, or worked in the shop, I forget, I think did both actually, for many, many years, really dedicated her life to this strange Villa Carpena and to living in the area that Mussolini had grown up in. And she actually died at the house. She wanted to stay living in the house for her final 2 months. I think she had cancer, and kind of wanted to die there in the presence of the Mussolini family. And a photo of her is displayed in the shop, and there's a commemorative plaque. So this kind of additional relics and shrines to kind of more contemporary fascist figures like her. This addition continues. So this is the area of the research that I really want to develop, this idea of Villa Carpena as a domestic shrine. And there are display cabinets throughout the house that are just bursting with exhibits. You can't move. I've never seen such a densely packed space. Every inch of the wall is covered in stuff throughout every single room. So we can see in the image on the right-hand side, this is a bullet that was said to have pierced Mussolini's leg, I think, in the First World War. But, you know, according to this letter and the guide who spoke to us, he suffered, but then he came back stronger. And there's all this kind of these narratives of living martyrdom that really emerge, and the kind of invincibility of Mussolini that emerged through these relics and signs of suffering. The image on the left is of Donna Rachele, so Mussolini's wife, This was apparently the wine that she drank on the day that she died, and apparently it has been left untouched since the moment that she died. So this idea of kind of time standing still, but also authenticity of both object and place is really central to this museum. So this wine is the original wine apparently, and the original place that it was left in. And there's a sense that this kind of spectral presence remains through the material culture and these kind of expressions of fascist nostalgia. And this authenticity is central actually to the whole, to the way that the museum presents itself in its entirety. So our tour was led by this guide who was wearing, in Italy to be a tour guide, you have like a license thing from the Comune. And this guy was wearing his license kind of tucked slightly under his jacket. But he started off by saying, I'm a licensed tour guide, I've done all my training, I know the history, what you'll hear is all authentic. What you hear in other places, i.e. the national museums, may not be authentic, but you're going to hear la vera storia, the real history here. So this idea of like debunking national myths that anti-fascist Italy has constructed is really central to this guy's tours, which was fascinating. And then he goes on and just I'm trying to think how to say this in a non-horrible way, but the history that he presents is completely inaccurate and wrong and completely biased, and all about the rehabilitation of Mussolini's memory and of fascism itself, and any undeniable elements of violence, persecution, perpetrated by Mussolini himself, he sort of laughs off in a like, oh yeah, but he was a kind of patriarchal figure, you know, or even with it was respects to his infidelity to his wife. He was known to be a womanizer and betrayed her often. That was a sign of his virility, right? So everything's kind of spun in favor of how he is represented. So the focus of this space is really on the rehabilitation of Mussolini's memory through myths pertaining to his domesticity and family life. And I mentioned before, there's this fake house, this mini house that he apparently built himself for his children, and lots of discussion of his commitment to his family. But above all, he was committed to Italy, and there's always this hierarchy that he suffered for his commitment to Italy itself. There was another thing that I wanted to mention. What was it? I think probably, yeah, just this idea of relics, right? So the authenticity and the material power of these objects that have actually touched the Mussolini family. And you really see people, the people who got on the coach from the march itself to this, so who are neo-fascist sympathizers, really looking at these objects and kind of having this moment of affective and emotional response because Mussolini had touched this, or Donna Rachele had drunk that. So this is where I draw in this idea of auratic value. Walter Benjamin has argued that authenticity of a thing is the essence of all that is transmissible from its beginning, ranging from its substantive duration to its testimony to the history of which it has experienced. And that's something we really see in this idea of his desk, right? So this is the desk that Mussolini supposedly, he was a journalist before he became a dictator. So there's ideas about him sitting here and writing, but then there's things about, you know, this is the desk where XYZ decree was signed, or whatever it might be pertaining to the strength of the fascist regime. And we really see this idea that by being physically close to these spaces, visitors are able to kind of feel their auratic value and get something themselves, and be kind of inspired by these objects. So I'm thinking of, I need to think further through this. I'm hoping one day to turn this into some kind of article, but this idea of material object as witness to the ideological project. And to me, the strangest bit and the real element that showed this kind of idea of mysticism, the coming together of secular and religious rites and rituals and kind of power, was in his bedroom. This is his former bedroom. And on the bed is laid, apparently, the final, getting my languages mixed, the uniform that he was wearing, the final uniform that Mussolini apparently wore before being killed. Apparently sent by an American collector who had got hold of it to Villa Carpena as, you know, its natural home. So this kind of repatriation of relics, which you really see is taken from kind of religious culture, where relics are moved to a place that's associated with the person. themselves. And apparently upon the return of this relic and the laying out of it on the bed, this mirror, which is next to me from the perspective of the photo on the left, so kind of at the end of the bed and to the left, this mirror reflected Mussolini's face. And this shape that you can see in the bottom right, this kind of, sorry, in the mirror picture, this kind of circular face shape, apparently, was Mussolini's spectral presence returning to the house once this final relic had been returned to the house. And people were standing in front of this mirror and going, oh, look, I can really see him, look, here he is, etc. This kind of omnipresence, eternal presence of Mussolini, thanks to the presence of these relics. And the guide tells stories about his presence returning to heal sick children and all of these completely bizarre stories. But this is really the instance that I saw this kind of absolute clashing together of mysticism, religious rites, rituals and iconography and relics themselves all coming together in this place, with the idea that Mussolini's continued presence is there and being upheld as an example to follow, and an occasion for these neo-fascists to recommit to his ideological project in his presence, in his reflection. And just before I conclude, that in itself is unsurprising, given that this idea of eternal presence is something that Mussolini himself, through reference to his own future death, but also through the continued commemorative and huge commemorative events held for fascist martyrs, and this idea of continued presence, he kind of perpetuated this idea. So this is a plaque that is on the wall of the tomb that I showed you the image of at the start. And just a quick translation. And it's taken from, apparently it's his words that were quoted in a book about his brother. I would be very naive if I were to ask to be left in peace after death. Around the tombs of leaders of great transformations, which we can call revolutions, there can be no peace. But everything that was done cannot be undone. While my spirit, now liberated from the material after its short life on earth, the immortal universal life of God will live on. I have only one wish: to be buried by my family in the cemetery of San Cassiano. So I want to return to this just to really draw together this idea of the eternal life after death, which is what we really see in the house itself, which I think is can be considered a shrine and part of this kind of broader local pilgrimage that Serenelli has written about. It's the site where time really kind of stands still, allowing for this social transmission of memory and this recommitment to neo-fascist ideology in the presence of these authentic relics relating to Mussolini and his family. So to conclude, and these are kind of shaky conclusions because this needs much more work and it's the first time I've really drawn these conclusions out, but I think the things that I want to explore further is this idea of the domestic setting as a site for rehabilitation of Mussolini's memory, the focusing on his kind of family side, his sort of his private rather than public life. The museum as part of this kind of pilgrimage route, the kind of culmination, the final shrine, this aura, the aura and the double authenticity of place and object that really seems to kind of capture people in their visit and really bring this kind of auratic value and affect this emotional response among visitors. And objects as witness, the kind of proximity of visitors to these physical objects that Mussolini and his family touched or used in some way as witness to his greatness. And there's an element of nostalgia here. Contemporary neo-fascists are often, people who are sympathetic to the original fascist regime are often called nostalgici, which is a really euphemistic term, a really problematic term. They're not nostalgics, they're neo-fascists, right? And we need to kind of be careful with our words, but in Italian kind of common parlance, they're often discussed as nostalgici. And I think the breaking down of the word nostalgia is really interesting because it literally means, from the Greek nostos, return to home, and algos, which is suffering. So this idea that the domestic longing for the domestic space is kind of tied up in nostalgia. And I think there's something in that in terms of the domestic space of this domestic shrine. Haven't quite worked out what that is, but maybe I'll get there soon, hopefully with a bit more thought. But I'll leave it there, I think. And we've got a bit of time for questions, though I am teaching at 10. So 15 minutes for questions, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'll just stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was fascinating. I have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to ask any of them yet because we would like to have the first question ideally come from students. So may I invite the students, please, to, you can just, if you have a question, maybe just turn on your microphone and probably start speaking. You can probably just do that. So I'm gonna be quiet and hope that somebody has a question here.
Hi, I had a couple of questions, if that's all right.
For sure.
Ben, go for it.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I was just thinking, I guess we're seeing like this kind of more support for far-right and fascist movements at the moment, and I was just wondering if you knew if sites like the ones you were talking about were becoming kind of more visited by kind of fascist pilgrims than maybe they have been in kind of like previous decades. And also I was wondering to what extent you think that toponyms kind of make a difference to the kinds of contested histories we're dealing with at the moment. I guess people sort of argue that we shouldn't kind of rename sites because it whitewashes history. But I was wondering if you thought that kind of renaming kind of helps win the kind of rhetorical argument against kind of non-fascist, against kind of fascists.
That's a really interesting set of questions. Thank you. So your first one, yeah, growing support. Sadly, yes. The numbers are kind of growing in terms of attendance of these events, but not just Predappio itself, which, as I mentioned, is actually really hard to get to. So there's kind of logistical problems there, but also there are a couple of mausoleums to fascist martyrs in places like the Verano cemetery in Rome, which is the big kind of monumental cemetery, and there's one in Milan and other places around Italy that continue to attract neo-fascists who gather to commemorate these fascist martyrs who died for the La Patria, according to the plaques. So yeah, unfortunately that is growing, and that's a project that I would really love to do one day, kind of tracking the ebbs and flows of this memory over time and how it kind of intersects with social and kind of political developments in Italy itself, because I suspect you can really track it in line with the strengthening and weakening of anti-fascist narratives in the national project. Your second question on toponyms, to answer that in relation to Italy, does it work? I mean, it's a PR exercise, isn't it, really? Because renaming a street does very little to change, you know, it's about kind of outward projection. What tends to happen is that these, in the case of Viale Matteotti, so the Italian Partisan Association, ANPI, on various anniversaries relating to Mussolini, tend to gather at the sites pertaining to Matteotti's memory, and so streets that have given his name, or piazzas that are given his name, or actual the site where he was kidnapped, for example, and they hold these kind of counter commemorations. So in my experience, the toponyms just become focal points for kind of this battle around commemorative events and collective identity politics. Not sure if that answers it, but it's definitely amazing to watch the kind of behaviours around these sites that bear different people's names.
Thanks, Amy. I think Tilda, you had a question?
It was just a quick question about the patches in the shops.
Are
you legally allowed to have one on your jacket? Just because I'm
in
Germany and you definitely wouldn't.
So yeah, well, they have completely different and far stricter rules in Germany, and I think that's just amazing to see. I went for a conference a couple of years ago in Ravenna for an Italian public history conference, academic one, and it was like a 5-day conference, and one afternoon there were kind of day trips and things to that people could go off on and bond during these trips, and I went. It was the first time I'd ever been to Predappio. They laid on this kind of coach to take people there, and as a group of public historians to kind of have a look. So these are academics who work on public history, who are kind of aware of the implications of public history narratives and representations and things, and they gathered in front of, so non-Italianists, but still, you know, interested in these themes, and they gathered in front of that shop, the Tricolore shop that I showed you the picture of, and they were laughing and they were taking selfies, and I just thought it was amazing to see this kind of the frivolous approach to Mussolini's memory and his imagery with this, you know, you see these caricatures of him with this massive chin and the big bulging forehead and things, and to think of you know, no one would ever a shock like that wouldn't exist in Germany, but to actually think that people, the differences in behavior in relationship to these two dictators is wildly different, like worlds apart. So to answer your question about patches, yeah, people in the march have their big, the younger guys tend to wear kind of like camouflage, like army things, and then they sew on the badges relating to Mussolini himself or the Repubblica di Salò or anything else relating to the regime. So yeah, they do wear it, shockingly. They also sell replica weapons, which is really frightening. Yeah, crazy place.
Great, thank you. Who else? Does anyone else have questions? And I open it up to staff as well now. Emma.
Hi, Amy. Thanks so much for your talk. It was super interesting. And I've got loads of questions, like Karen said, but I guess I was really interested specifically in your idea about the material object as witness. Because I've done some work on post-socialism memory and kind of the kitschiness of, you know, sickle and hammer t-shirts being resold, or ladders, or the GDR museum in Berlin. And then there's also the space of, say, somewhere like Leon in Nicaragua, which is like a shrine or a memory or a site of memory for Sandinistas. But specifically with relation to, I guess, the object as witness, how do you think through that? Is it in relation to, say, the community or to individuals, or is it kind of how it's set up as a shrine? Or I guess, could you speak a little bit more about that?
I would love to be able to, but it's really just something that I've been thinking while writing this in the last week. I was like, it's a witness, and you know, it's something that I really need to read up more on. But I just was amazed to see the behavior of having like done this direct observation of behavior within the museum, the kind of effective, with an A, power of these objects. People, there's a chair upstairs, for example, that was like a kind of easy chair, like a reading chair, that they let people sit in, and people really sit down and kind of like sort of shudder in some sort of moment of emotional response to the fact that Mussolini had sat in this chair. Yeah, I need to think through it, and I would love to hear hear about your work on it, because it's really something that came to me in the last couple of days that's very thin that I need to strengthen.
It's fascinating. And I don't want to hug the mic, but it also reminded me a lot of obviously Catholic culture and relics and like saintly relics.
Yeah, and this journey of the relics back to their kind of natural resting place, which is what is done with martyrs' bodies under the fascist regime, which is, I've written an article about this, but like the repatriation of bodies from fascists who died abroad, and that journey is as important as the actual commemorative event that's held to rebury them. You know, the journey back of this uniform was really marked with some sort of event at the Strange Museum itself.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Do we have other questions, or can I actually ask? I want to ask a quick question, I guess, which is a little bit more about the demographics of these visitors. I was curious, I guess, if they're all Italian, if it includes Italian diasporic visitors, right? Because you talked a little bit about the anti-fascists in the US, but I was curious if there's a diasporic community that also treats Mussolini as this kind of martyr and would be involved in this. And is it really, like, what kind of numbers are we talking about? You talked a little bit about the fact that obviously these are people who were not there as witnesses or participants. These are people who share in this communal handed down memory, but would they also all identify, would you say, as fascists or neo-fascists? And what, okay, this is not a small question. I'm sorry. Okay, just give me the very digest version of who they are and what they believe.
So predominantly male. I saw a handful of women, literally like 5 or something. So that made me and my friend who works on the memory of fascism and is also female kind of stand out quite a lot. Predominantly male, some really young people who have absolutely no idea about the history of the regime itself. So we had some interesting conversations, and just the historical knowledge is completely absent. So yeah, they are just there as this kind of like, it's almost like a protest participation moment. It's their space, right? It's a kind of festival atmosphere. It's really extraordinary. So there's a big piazza in front of the church that they then go into, and people turn up on their motorbikes or their cars, and they open their boot and they do like what do you call it, where you like serve alcohol out the boot of a car and kind of gather around a space, and it's
tailgating.
Yeah, exactly. It's really, a strange version, and they kind of shout over the car park like "Ciao Francesco, viva il Duce," and it's just a sort of social get together. There's a couple of, as I mentioned, elderly people who actually did live through the tail end of the regime itself, who are kind of lauded as sort of heroic. They're revered themselves. I didn't meet anyone foreign, so all kind of Italians. Some had come from southern Italy and journeyed up, so they tend to be the ones that went onto the museum as part of this kind of weekend of dark tourism and reverence of Mussolini and his life. I don't know the answer to your question about fascist support in Little Italy's now. I've written about the 1920s fascist support in Little Italy's and kind of these massive commemoration ceremonies with tens of thousands of people gathering to honor black shirts on the street of New York, but I don't know about today. But I definitely didn't meet any other foreigners, which was why we were sort of stared at as non-Italians and female.
Sorry, I was just wondering, on top of that, with like in terms of the demographic, would you say that the people who support and sort of come to visit, would you like, I don't know, I don't mean to be like rude or sort of, but like, would you say they're a little bit uneducated, or are there like academics and people there who go and actually support like fashion and stuff? I
can't really answer that very well because I can't say that I spoke to that many people, because I was a bit, honestly, sort of frightened of the whole experience, being kind of young female. Yeah. It wasn't a nice feeling being there, but generally the conversations that I did have showed a real kind of lack of historical critical understanding of the regime itself and kind of the crimes perpetuated under the regime in Italy and abroad.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amy, I'm conscious that we have more questions, but that you have to go teach. So I maybe if you have a chance to send a message out later to the group and answer questions. I did want to thank you so much. This was, as you can see, everybody's very interested. And I think also in a teacherly way, you did a really nice job of sort of saying direct observation. This is what, here was my primary text, and here's how I'm building on other scholars. This is my intervention. So I think, massively helpful for those students, especially writing their dissertations. Really, really well done. Thank you. Thank you. Much.
Thanks for having me. I'm just going to put my email in the
perfect
in the chat, and if you have any questions, burning questions, I'd be happy to answer them via email. But thank you. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.